Welcome to session 14, which focuses on world Englishes. Before following the training session, please spend some time to review what we looked at in language awareness. Consider the usage of written and spoken English today. Look at the map. What is it showing? Where English is spoken around the world and to what extent? How does it make you feel? Whether we like it or not, English seems to be the most universal language that the world has chosen to communicate in. World English. What does that actually mean? English is spoken in so many countries around the world, some as a first language and others as a second or third language. English in England is changing all the time. Words die out each year, and at the same time new lexical items are continually added to dictionaries. It is hard to keep up with how languages evolve and change with so much worldwide cultural influence. To give you an example of how it has changed, here are some of the words that have been added to the Oxford English Dictionary in the last couple of years. Have you seen any of these words before? Can you predict their meanings and use them in a context? Do you have an equivalent in your own language? In the Language Awareness and Skills module, we explored the current usage of written and spoken English. Can you recall some of the points we talked about? We drew your attention to geography, age, and social groups. We also mentioned register and context. In the writing skills session, we saw the acronym WRITE. Can you remember what it stood for? Who, register, information, text type, edit. Added to the factors of register and context, I asked you to consider the fact that many students have external influences which determine their use of English. For example, it's common for students to acquire language through films, television, and YouTube videos. How did you learn your English? This leads us on to consideration for learners and teachers, both inside and out of the classroom. I'd like you to consider how you could respond to these questions. Why do your students need to learn English? Who do they or who will they communicate in English with? Where do they or will they need to use or understand English? As a teacher, do you believe it is important for you to be interested and knowledgeable about the culture of English-speaking countries? The focus of this session is to continue to reflect on the context you are teaching in and therefore the target language your students should be working towards to ensure communicative competence. The majority of points raised for your consideration are taken from the seminal book Global Englishes by Jennifer Jenkins, who is Professor of Global Englishes and Founding Director of the Centre of Global Englishes at the University of Southampton, UK. We're going to start by looking at English as the lingua franca. Let's start with a practical situation. Your student is a production manager in a company. Is there a difference in the language he or she needs when attending an international conference and participating in a project with a UK-based company? To clarify, a meeting between EU members involves people from different countries meeting and communicating. Therefore, translators are at hand. The non-English speakers who communicate in English are easily understood. But when British and Irish native speakers communicate, the others need a translation. This is because non-English speakers who learn English tend not to interact or communicate with native English speakers. Therefore, they only understand non-English accents. When communicating with UK native speakers in both formal and informal situations, the non-native speakers should be aware of and sensitive to the meaning conveyed by intonation, as well as the use of phrasal verbs and idiom. Do you have any personal experience of this? Do you think native speakers need training to prepare for communicating in an ELF situation? So, as a teacher, you need to be aware of how and where your students are going to use their English. The Imperial English UK GES courses do not assume that the students are going to be in a native-speaking country or are necessarily going to be communicating with native speakers in English. The unit topics reflect this. For example, Unit 1 of Level 1 is set at an international conference. Other units focus on the learner's ability to express their own views on subjects or reflects on how to develop their language and study skills. The Imperial English Academic Skills course covers topics such as the environment that are relevant worldwide. In terms of standard English, Imperial English UK Materials offers models of form and function that are to be found in Cambridge ESOL examinations or considered acceptable in IELTS. But as you can see from the description here, there does not appear to be any great benefit from using standard English. It is the ability to communicate your message effectively, as with members of the EU Parliament, that is important. Seidhofer suggests the problem in the European Union is how English is thought of. English should not be regarded as the native language of British and Irish native speakers, but as an ELF. We've considered a student who is preparing for work-related scenarios in a conference and work placement setting. But what English would you expect from someone preparing for a higher education degree at a UK, USA or Australian university? What we are considering is EMI, which stands for English Medium Instruction. Many universities around the world describe themselves as international, with staff and students from other countries and different first languages. Take a moment to reflect on this. How could it affect what you teach your students and what you accept from them? The situation is set out in this slide. When English is used as the medium of instruction in universities, it is generally assumed to be the academic English of native English speakers. But a number of researchers consider that the E in EMI should be ELF rather than English, so become ELFA, ELF in academic settings. In fact, descriptions of how English is used in international EMI communities have identified a number of new linguistic features, a few of which we will look at now. These features are noted in a corpus study by Morayan and Metzer-Kelleter. Look through these points. Would they be acceptable in the setting you work in, or would they be considered errors? How far does it depend on whether items such as these are spoken or written? Do these features confuse meaning? This now moves us on to the wider picture of ELF and global Englishes outside the classroom. Many countries have a local English. These include India, Hong Kong and China, where there are differences both in the ways in which English functions in each context and in the attitudes of their users towards their own English. Indian English is an established and widely accepted variety, while the status of Hong Kong English is still unclear. English in China is still developing, but because Chinese are not likely to communicate with each other in English, English there is not expected to be regarded as a variety in the same way as it is in India or Singapore. A large part of Jenkins' work looks at the history of the expansion and use of the English language around the world. And in many parts of the world, like the African continent, India and the surrounding countries, as well as Singapore and Malaysia, this was a result of colonialism. Professor Jenkins also examines the government policies towards the English language teaching and its status in countries such as Spain and, of course, across the European Union as a whole. These historical and political developments are not key features of a teacher training course, but it is an aspect you might be interested in exploring, and it might become part of your career development. Yet, can these forms of local English be ignored by course designers and teachers? Are they errors caused by first language interference or examples of how English has evolved in particular settings? Let's see how you react to the examples of Indian English on the next slide. These are common and normal Indian English examples. How do you feel about them? Do they seem strange? Normal? Please look at the text on this slide. What are your views on it? Briefly returning to the language awareness session, another possible view is given in this slide. Do you feel fossilization presents a version of English? Can you relate this view to what we said when looking at language awareness? The following slides have examples of English language use in several different countries. We'll consider if you feel there are any language errors and if they might cause confusion between ELF speakers and/or ELF speakers and native speakers. The examples we're going to look at are taken from a survey of post-colonial Englishes, or New English, by which we mean countries that used to be British colonies. Before presenting the examples, here are the criteria used to define post-colonial English. There are other definitions, but for our limited purposes, this is sufficient in this session. It has developed through the education system. This means that it has been taught as a subject and in some cases also used as a medium of instruction in regions where English is not the main language. It has developed in an area where a native variety of English was not spoken by most of the population. It is used for a range of functions amongst those who speak or write it in the region where it is used. It has become localized by adopting some features of its own, such as sounds, intonation patterns, sentence structures, words, and expressions. Because of time constraints, we'll focus on grammar, but as you can imagine, pronunciation features are also features of interest. As when we looked at Indian English, let's see how you feel about this use of English. Do you regard these examples as acceptable English language usage? Looking at verbs in grammar, I imagine your students produce language like this at times. How do you feel now you know that this is acceptable use in some regions? Question tags can be a problematic area to teach, so it is interesting to see how the uses of question tags has developed in some forms of post-colonial English. Are these errors that your students produce? Methri and Bat point out that these undifferentiated tags play an important pragmatic role, exhibiting how linguistic form is constrained by cultural constraints of politeness. The general tag is seen as non-impositional and mitigating, whereas the canonical tag is seen as assertive. So now we are moving away from grammar to functional language, or, as we have just noted, pragmatics and cultural norms. The quote on the slides can be related to face, which was explored by Brown and Levinson. If I refer to the concept on this slide and say, "It's obvious, isn't it?" I am imposing on you. If you disagree with me, you might be afraid of looking foolish in front of the other participants. But the general tag that has developed removes this threat. A simple example of face is if I were to say, "Get me a coffee." That's an order. Why should I speak to you in this way? You might respond with, "Get it yourself." More appropriate for me is to ask, "If you're going to the kitchen, could you get me a coffee?" This does not challenge your face. I have given you the opportunity to say no without damaging our relationship. So, there would seem to be a logic in this new English. Just as my wife, she passed her Cambridge, reflects a community where the first language does not have an aspect in its verb forms. At this point of the session, we need to pause and collect our thoughts. We have seen how there are variations of English language all over the world. We have also considered the possibility that many of our students will not need to use their English language skills to communicate with native speakers. For our students, English may be a way to further their education and career, or to broaden their horizons through travel and friendship. Perhaps it is wrong to see these non-native Englishes as deficient, and in the global context, these Englishes could be a matter of difference which is based on vital socio-linguistic matters of identity, creativity, and cultural contact. Think of the scenario of a group of mixed nationality international students following a degree course at a UK university. Outside of lectures and seminars, what is important? That they use grammatically accurate standard English, or they can communicate effectively and form supportive relationships. Hopefully, this session has made you think about how English is used outside the classroom and how your students might use English in the future. But it is the language examinations that students work towards that have a major influence on what happens in the classroom. This is called washback. The methodologies and materials that are promoted are communicative approaches with an emphasis on task-based learning, learner autonomy, and English-only textbooks. In contrast, memorization and translation are largely overvalued. Do you have any strong views on this? Your decisions in class are partly dictated by international examinations. Professor Jenkins highlights the following British Council quotes. The Director of English and Examinations at the British Council wrote, "Every teacher and learner of English in the world should have access to the skills, ideas and materials they require from Britain." While the British Council's India website states, "Teaching is at the heart of our cultural relations work in India. We are a world leader in English language teaching. Our certified teachers help you learn English using a curriculum developed and proven through more than 75 years of experience and in over 110 countries." Jenkins expresses surprise that the British Council seems to believe that in India, where English has been spoken for centuries, learners still need input from the British Council in order to learn English. We'll end by coming back to you and your roles. Perhaps the attitude shown by the British Council has disheartened you. But this quote from Seidhofer highlights the values of the shared experience of non-native teachers of English and their students. To close this session, I'd like self-reflection and input from you. Firstly, regarding your views on what is required from a teacher. And finally, to consider your country's place in world Englishes. Remembering that this module is part of the Teaching in Different Circumstances topic, how far do you agree with the checklist for teachers outside English native speaker countries? Note the emphasis on cultural awareness. Do you agree? Note how point B makes clear that the teacher is a model, so the form and function of the English the teacher uses in class is important exposure for the learners. Briefly review how a teacher can identify learner needs. For point H, consider what it means to be a teacher. This session has only touched on what is a huge and ever-evolving aspect of English language learning and use. We have not looked at the writings of expert David Crystal, the influence of the internet, or considered the spread of the Spanish language, all of which have important contributions to make. But for you as teachers, we have looked at world Englishes in relation to the context you teach in, the needs of your students, the cultural aspect of the development of new Englishes, the influence of international examinations such as IELTS, the role of a teacher in a non-English speaking country. In your country or region, when was English language introduced to your country? How? By whom? Do you notice any status shifts in English language in relation to other foreign and local languages? Can you identify what might have been the motivations or interests behind the introduction and current uses of English?
These are the hashtag words to take from this session. Write a short summary of the session using the hashtag words and examples where possible.